Welcome and thank you for coming to the Art of Digital. I'm Pete Townsend. I'm the designer at the chair in Digital Economy at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. Thank you, all of you, for coming as part of London Tech Week. The chair in Digital Economy, we're an interesting group. We are sort of the nexus between academia, the public sector, but also the private sector. And it's sort of from that vantage point where we can sort of translate research into practice and helping organisations large and small to navigate their future. So we've come, our team and myself, we've come all the way from Brisbane to sort of share some thoughts around the art of digital. Now, the art of digital, aspirational, responsible and trusted. These points, we've heard so much about the media this year, and we'll be unpacking those today through this session. So that the way that the session's going to run is we'll have a keynote and then 3 fireside chats. And we sort of want you to be a fly on the wall with those discussions that we have with our speakers and presenters here. And then it'll be at the end of the Q&A session that we can really come alive and join that conversation. And that's when I'll be passing around the mic. So let's get into it. Now I'd like to introduce our fearless leader and head of the chair in Digital Economy, Professor Marek Kowalkiewicz. Marek, thank you.
We need to talk about trust. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We need to talk about trust in the digital economy. Now, you might have noticed something interesting happening recently. There are a couple of screenshots that I took in the past weeks. 27th of April, BGR, so brand report in India, listed Facebook as one of the most trusted IT companies in the region. One of the most trusted IT companies in the region. Around the same time, it was really basically within a week, there was a study done in US which put Facebook, the same business, as one of the least, well, clearly one of the least trusted organizations as perceived by the users. So from an academic perspective, this is where you see that something very interesting is happening. You look at it and think, hey, perhaps people simply don't understand what trust is, or they have a misunderstanding, or whenever they use the word, they think about completely different concepts. So we decided to look into it, and that's how the concept of this event and the conversations that we're going to have today really started. Earlier this year, I had a really good conversation with the Chief Digital Officer of Brisbane, Kat Matson. And Brisbane, even though they're so far away, or we're so far away from here, it's actually a place where there's a lot of leading things happening. So Chief Digital Officer in Brisbane was the second ever Chief Digital Officer of a city in the world, and the first female. So the Brisbane was really leading that. Conversation with Kat Matson was all about, and there's a podcast about it, was all about the fact that 2018 is going to be a year of responsible tech. That was a few months ago. You all know what happened in the past few months. So we're actually quite happy that we talked about it. What I'm not too happy about is, while we were having this discussion, I might have said that some of the organizations need to be regulated, and we might need to regulate the internet. Then I asked my team to cut it out from the final version of the podcast. Now I'm thinking we could have kept it. Because really what's happening is really the world changing and being very, very challenging in this space. So together with my other colleague, Professor Michael Roseman of QUT, we wrote what we call a minimum viable research report, right? We have all the MVPs and so on. We thought researchers should have their MV as well, minimum viable research report. It's basically a document which invites everyone else to contribute to it, to discuss and so on. And tomorrow you will receive an email from us, a digital goodie bag with a link to that minimum viable research report. You can also look it up. It's publicly available on the internet, but we'll share that with you. We basically unpacked the art of digital. What we had to start with, though, is we really wanted to understand, as academics, why are we even talking about those topics at the moment? How did we come to this situation that that aspiration, responsibility, and trust are important. And so I'm going to unpack it in the next 5 minutes before we go into the conversation so that we're all on the same page. And the minimum viable research report is basically stating that when organizations have been developing their excellence, they start with engineering excellence. So engineering excellence is the world of chief technical officers, is the world where organizations talk about developing the best search engine, the most secure payment method, or perhaps the fastest electric car. The words that are used by organizations that are focusing on engineering excellence is relevance, reliability, validity of the solution. CTOs, chief technology officers, are the superstars, are the rock stars of those organizations. But at some stage, those organizations realize that perhaps next step needs to be taken. And that's where they move to corporate excellence. It's not only the technology that is a differentiator anymore, but now they need to think about the efficiency, about the time to market, about time, cost, and quality. So the search engine company will think about a search engine that never goes down, the 5 nines or 12 nines of however many nines of availability you would have these days. A financial institution would talk about a financial system that can process millions of transactions at a time. And perhaps the electric car company would try to meet the demand. Right? So develop in such a way that they're not just cool, but if someone orders their car, they don't have to wait for 2 or 3 years. And the rock stars of those organizations are chief operation officers, the COOs. At some stage, when organizations reach corporate excellence, they're not ahead of the pack anymore because there will be others reaching that corporate excellence. So the question is, what is the next step? And the next step that we have seen is customer excellence. So those organizations that are excellent in engineering space, in the corporate space, now are trying to think, okay, the customer should be the focus, right? And we all hear those keywords, right? Desirability, feasibility, viability, design thinking, understanding of the customers. Chief digital, chief design officers are the ones that are the rock stars of the organizations, right? So the search engine company is focusing on finding, not searching anymore, right? Being where the customers are, not giving them a system that doesn't just go down. The financial organization perhaps looks into attracting their customers so they leave other organizations and want to switch to this one. The electric car company, we had actually a bit of a problem with this one. We thought maybe they will just shoot a car and send it to space, because that's sort of what gets people excited, right? But we might need to have some better ideas there. So the desirability, feasibility, viability have been a focus of a lot of organizations, right? We all know this one. But again, just like the other types of excellence, at some stage, everyone else catches up. And so what we realized, and that's what we speculate in the minimum viable research report, is that the next stage is societal excellence. So organizations are asking themselves, how could I be more aspirational? How could I be more responsible? How could I be more trusted by my customers, by the environment, by the world that I live in? This is where those organizations, the search engine company, now is thinking about providing access to internet to communities all around the world where it wasn't possible before. The financial company might be looking into microloans and supporting those who were previously outside of the financial system. And we're not really sure what happens in the electric car company, right? So that's again what we're exploring here. Will we have chief trust officers? Will we have chief societal excellence officers? We're not sure yet, but definitely this is the world that we're living in at the moment, and aspiration, responsibility, and trust are the main pillars of it. Now, what is trust? What is responsibility? What is aspiration? What we're going to do today is put a stake in the ground, and we're going to say, here are our definitions of those terms. You don't have to agree with them. The point here is, we'll use them as navigation points or as signposts for our conversations. So trust, we've decomposed it, and trust for us today is all about reliance and credence. Reliance is having the right skills, having the right attributes to provide services. Credence is all about providing the right quality of those services, right? So I trust an organization if they provide the services in a good quality, right? It's a very narrow, if you will, understanding of trust, right? There's this trust, the general one, which we've seen at the beginning of my presentation. Here we're narrowing down so that we can specifically talk about this. Responsibility is all about duty and accountability. Duty is where organizations try to make sure that whatever they do the right thing. Accountability is where organizations, if something goes wrong, accept the blame and react appropriately, right? So we could imagine organizations that are dutiful but not accountable, for instance. We could also imagine organizations that are not really dutiful but accountable, right? We didn't really think about it, but it happened, so let's do something about it. Finally, there's aspiration. Aspiration is all about having a purpose. Now, purpose is that higher goal that an organization wants to achieve. And then impact. Impact is all about the actual achievement. It doesn't really help if a purpose cannot be achieved. So this is why it's important to think about both, purpose and impact. All right? So these are the three pillars of societal excellence: trust, responsibility, and aspiration. What we're going to do right now is we're going to have a conversation with our fantastic panelists. They're going to be more of a fireside type of conversations where we're going to unpack each of those in a podcast-style conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Marek. So, just before I introduce our guest speakers for the first fireside chat, can I ask the people in the middle row? We're a full house here, so if this middle row could just shuffle over so we can accommodate our last two guests. Thank you very much. Next slide. So, the three fireside chats. We've heard about the art, A-R-T, and we're going to unpack that, but in reverse. So, ending on aspiration. So let's first, Marek, if you just want to click over to the next one. Oh, there we go. Can I invite up Leanne Kemp of Everledger and Dr. Ivano Bongiovanni. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, Leanne, Ivano. Let's start with Leanne. Leanne, you're running an organization that's helping track diamonds and all sorts of other beautiful things around the world and wherever they are, whatever happens to them transaction-wise, in a very distributed manner, right? So you're disintermediating the market. Is that right? Is that a good understanding of Everledger?
We're co-evolving the market.
You're co-evolving the market. What if Everledger goes down? Can I trust Everledger?
In short, yes. Mm-hmm. And will it go down? No. So the work at the very core of our business is blockchain. So blockchain is a distributed ledger technology, and by the very nature of the architecture of that technology, it's distributed. So Everledger doesn't just sit in a siloed one server in the world. We sit across multiple nodes across the world. So for Everledger to go down would mean the entirety of the internet would go down, and that would be Armageddon.
All right. So that basically means that we're reaching this level of trust where it's really, if you trust the internet as the global network, you can trust an organization such as Everledger, which is a major step, right, compared to the traditional focus where we would focus on trust toward organizations or even individuals.
So that's a pretty high statement to make, and I wouldn't probably agree with that. So I don't think just trusting the internet means you trust Everledger.
Awesome.
We're not necessarily a blockchain company, even though we've placed blockchain within the fabric of the industry globally. Mm-hmm. We hold material science experts that know and understand the chemical composition of a diamond. We use emerging stack technology like machine vision to be able to see the stress fractures within the stone. So it takes a lot more than just one single technology to be able to transform a 500-year-old industry.
Got it.
But certainly Everledger has enabled the aggregation of very important forensic level data. So just like we're seeing transformation efforts happen in health, with understanding the health of human beings or the identity of human beings. The sensitivity of that private data, of course, is a concern to every one of us that sits in the room today. But certainly diamonds from that aspect, they're dumb and expensive. So the diamonds don't necessarily have personal rights. They can't hold up their hand and say, where's my personal diamond data? So we've looked at it at a point of objects, and we know and understand that diamonds, whilst they're quite valuable, they're a huge store of value in the world, but there's the light and day of industry. So we do know that anti-money laundering is still existing within the planet. Diamonds is a vehicle and has been a vehicle of terrorist-funded activities. And so these are the types of actions that we want to focus on and help to reduce the risk on global supply chains, on conflict, gems, metals and minerals.
That's very interesting. So in the minimum viable research report, we're actually also talking about the concept of evil ethics, right? And I think, one thing that you mentioned here, when we talk about diamonds and, all sorts of things that could be happening in those markets, you could actually talk about trust when you're a criminal as well, right? Which takes me to a conversation that I wanted to have with Ivano as well. We talk about technology and the trust toward technologies. But Ivano, are human aspects, can they be controlled by technologies? Do we need to keep in mind what could go wrong when it comes to humans?
Well, absolutely, Marek. So it's very actually very interesting what Leanne said about the idea of having humans back into the picture. And I think it's something that when we talk about trust, sometimes probably we forget. Mm-hmm. So the idea of trusting technologies doesn't necessarily translate into the fact that then as customers or as users, we're going to immediately trust a company. And that's why I think that the whole conversation around putting humans and users back into the security equation or in the security calculation, I think it's absolutely right on the spot, right? So that's one of the areas in which we are kind of conducting some research. And I think that the concept of trust is very, very hard to define, right? Mm-hmm. So we all know that it's the currency of the digital economy, but then in the equation of trust, we can put pretty much whatever we want, from delighting our customers into making sure that our customers have a feeling of security and safety when they do business with us or when they use our technologies. One thing that we sometimes forget when we design our security, for instance, is users themselves, all right? So one of the questions in this space could be probably, how can we co-design our security with our users? And I see that a lot of times when I look into, for instance, cybersecurity training or information security training, most of those programs, at least the ones that I saw, are not really designed thinking of the user that will need to use them, right? Yeah. Or that will need to learn something from them. So why don't we ask our users, what do you want to know about information security? Or what do you want to know about cyber? What is not clear to you? Can we help you better understanding to kind of increase the overall trust?
All right. I'm going to throw a spanner in the works here. I hope. Look, about 15, 20 years ago, when I had a credit card, I would go through my bank statements, credit card statements, to make sure that there was no fraud, nothing like that, right? But these days, I don't really check my credit card statements anymore. I'm assuming that the bank is taking care of it, and if something goes wrong, they will let me know. So trust, so some of the services, the trust is disappearing in a way. I don't have to think about it anymore. Just like I don't have to think about whether that elevator that I'm going to step into is going to take me to the right floor or not, right? It's just assumed. So, Leanne, do you think that Everledger at some stage could become transparent, like something that's happening in the background, and people just don't worry because it is taking care of all that it needs to be taken care of?
So, again, the quick answer is yes, and proven now. We're 3 years old. We started here in the heart of London in April 2015, and of course you can tell by my accent I'm Australian, bloody proud Queenslander, and from Brisbane. So there you go. So certainly, I mean, we are already in that state today with Everledger. 2.2 million diamonds has shown that there is industry confidence around the work that we've already performed, and now it's the ability to be able to take the complexities of our technologies and enable that to be as persuasive as the iPhone that sits in the hands of every single one of us, or an Android device. I just returned from New York last week, which was a pretty monumental milestone for not only our company but the industry, where we released to the market some of the work that we had conducted over the last 2 years with the Gemological Institute of America. Now, they grade and certify 80% of the world's diamonds, and the last 2.5-year engineering effort from our team has enabled that now to be public knowledge and public space. And we also have 25 retailers globally. One of them is, again, a very proud, large Australian retailer, which we'll see Everledger being situated as the Intel inside of that company when it comes to consumer-facing trust at store globally. So,
wonderful. So what I'm hearing, and trying to generalize what I'm hearing here, is we're starting to talk about trust as a service. There are technologies that could be applied in various industries, various scenarios, not just diamonds anymore, right? So I'm assuming the retailer is not selling diamonds.
So there's a few angles to this. So we think about provenance as a platform or provenance as a service. It doesn't exist in the world yet, and this isn't just limited to millennials. The question about where things come from is very important, but we don't have provenance as a platform. We have procurement, and certainly we've seen very large companies proliferate across the globe, SAP Ariba being a prime example of that, but provenance and the items and where it's come from isn't necessarily anything that's front and centre. But more importantly, in today's world, it's actually a corporate responsibility, let alone now legislation being passed, which deems it, if you're a certain size company, they have to prove transparency. It is no longer a CSR effort, a corporate social responsibility that hides under the marketing department. Parts of these legislations is deeming that directors have to make public declarations about this. So we're seeing it moving to the boardroom, which is a perfect time for a company like us to understand where we can play a role.
Got it. So it's clearly showing that societal excellence is really, becoming the focus of organizations. Now, let's start to wrap this discussion up. We will have time for Q&As after the three conversations as well. Let's talk a bit about two things. One of them is, what can organizations, maybe not the likes of Everledger, but your average business, do to increase trust? But also, let's talk about the jobs of the future, and feel free to sort of jump between those two. Ivano, do you see any jobs of the future emerging in this trust space?
Well, you were talking before about Chief Trust Officer. I think that could be a good way, a good proxy of trying to understand how we will be able as companies to unpack our jobs of the future. I probably can talk from the security side of things. Well, the job that a CISO does today, it's probably going to change a lot in the future. There's that idea that security is not something that is only just left to the background of the organization, but it's something that is kind of being put a little bit forward to the front office, if you want. I imagine that in the future we could get to the point where security might become, for instance, a source of competitive advantage, more or less, in the scenario of companies. And certainly some regulations are pushing into that direction. If you imagine GDPR, for instance, here in Europe, building a nice, if you want, framework around having companies starting thinking actively to how they manage information security and to what they do if a breach happens, because, well, that regulation pretty much takes a position on saying, well, we know that something is going to happen. We cannot be 100% secure, so it's better to start thinking of what we do if something happens.
So security as opportunity rather than just a challenge.
Absolutely, and that's why there's a lot of conversation around the concept of cyber resilience. All right, so being able to bounce back if something happens, because something will happen in a way or another.
Got it. Leanne, your thoughts?
So I think some of these large financial institutions, the day that they recognise it's no longer about them, it's about you, the customer, and enabling the transfer of power or responsibility to that customer or to that user is probably the financial institution that's going to be here for another 150 odd years. But more importantly, outside of that, and we've seen legislation starting to happen with GDPR, etc., but I think about it in a different way. you know, we as a set of people on the planet, we consume everything, and it's been a race to the bottom. Let's do it faster, cheaper. If we can't do it in our own country, let's send it out to an emerging market. Let's get them to do it faster and cheaper, and it's just squeezing and squeezing and squeezing. And then 10 years later, we look back and we think, oh my God, we've just strangled every turtle. We've got a problem in the Great Barrier Reef, and actually we screwed the planet. But let's keep going faster. Let's actually keep taking the products that we think are good, that the consumers want, and it's a race to the bottom. I believe, and we're a part of the World Economic Forum, and as a part of my work there is about the global commons, and to ensure that there's a consciousness around product and around people. And when we are designing for product and we think about innovation and innovation teams, we need to reinvent physical product at a sustainability level. So if we are thinking about what does the world in 2030 look like, and the next most largest emerging supply chain would be stored energy. So you talked about the example of an autonomous car manufacturer. What should they be thinking about? What should they be doing with trust? They should be thinking about cobalt and lithium. They should be thinking about where these batteries are, not only from a car manufacturer, but Apple. Where's the consciousness of all of the metals and minerals that reside inside of these devices? And so that, you know, the romance that we had a while ago about circular economy and shared economy with Uber and Airbnb, there's an entirely different world that's going to be forming between now and 2030 when you start thinking about Mother Earth's assets. She's angry, and for a very good reason. So that's what we should be thinking about, is the companies that can embed the process of innovation and commercialization and rethink product at the total level is the company that's going to survive. Beyond just what we're all screaming about with privacy of data and Facebook and all the madness, really, I think we've got a bigger problem on our hands than just data and personal information.
Absolutely. Well, Leanne, this is wonderful. I feel like we need to bring you back here in 15 minutes when we talk about aspiration, and we will, because that's a very important topic. For the moment, Leanne and Ivano, thank you very much.
Thanks, Marek.
Thank you. Now on to responsible. So could I please introduce Dr. Paula Dootson from the Chair in Digital Economy and Andrew Grill, the Practical Futurist.
Oh, wonderful. It's a bit like a production line, isn't it, right? So let's get the next two speakers. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. Andrew, the Practical Futurist. It's really good to see some practical futurists, right? Not only those that talk, but get stuff done. That's important.
Well, I deliberately styled myself as the Practical Futurist because while people like Arthur C. Clarke were amazing in seeing things 30 years out, most people that stand in front of me don't have 30 years, 30 months or 30 weeks. They want to know next week what to do. So I try and give practical advice, and being an Australian living in London for the last 12 years, I'm very pragmatic.
Yeah, so I'm the only one without Australian accent here on the panel. Paula, sometimes we call you Dr. Deviance. Would you like to unpack it for us?
Well, I'm not a dodgy doctor, so all the research I do is in understanding why people do things that are maybe illegal or non-normative or a bit different from everyone else, and either find a way to design it out or encourage it because maybe it's a good thing. What I really want to pick out with this responsibility topic is this idea of duty, because when you talk about it, you make it sound very black and white. And I'm going to throw organizations a bit of a bone here and say it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, because people as a society, we're really confident in agreeing on what is outright acceptable and outright unacceptable, but most of the stuff in between can be quite questionable. Just because there's a law that says something's wrong, people can look at it and go either I don't agree with it, or yeah, I get it, but here's a unique situation that I'm in and here's my justification for not sticking to it. So, and I think one of the biggest things with the digital economy is the faster rate that technology evolves, legal frameworks and policy frameworks can't keep up with that. So how do organizations actually know what is the right thing to do?
What is the right thing to do? Speaking of, and Andrew, we had this interesting conversation about a week ago, how organizations in tech space seem to be evolving their mission from, the it just works mantra through don't do evil mantra. We talked about this one, right? To let's make the world a better place, one something, ERP or whatever it would be at a time, right? Is this the world we live in? Don't do evil? That seems to have disappeared, right?
Well, I'm sure Paula has a definition of evil. It's a bit grey because while our friends at Google started out saying don't be evil, I think they could be the next one that stand before the grand jury. Give you an example. I read recently that Oracle and Google seem to be having some fight in Australia. And so Oracle did some research and worked out that every month Google, if you have an Android phone, is sending a gigabyte of data back to Google. Now, when you click agree conditions, you've agreed. Now, buried in the term somewhere, it probably doesn't say we're going to send back barometric pressure and if you stepped outside the car. And so I think because consumers don't know that's happening, they don't know that it's evil. And so at the moment, I think a lot of companies are getting away with what is probably a very fine line. And we talked about in the last session, I think with the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and GDPR happening within the same month, consumers are now going, they're doing what with my data? And when it gets to the front page of the Evening Standard or the Sunday Telegraph or the Sun Herald or whatever, I think consumers are now saying, well, that's not fair. And for years and years, we've got away with it because consumers haven't been empowered. And I think GDPR is a huge opportunity to allow consumers to start paring back and getting control of their own data.
Well, I think that's really interesting because I think people only care at a point where it stops being convenient or helpful to them in progressing in their interests.
Yeah. But if you realise that probably you're worth $3,000 to $5,000 or pounds a year to these companies, you'd say, where's my cheque? And that's probably what we're worth. And they're saying, well, you get free Facebook and free Gmail in return. There's not a fair value exchange. And I think in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll see a real shift.
That's interesting, right? So, I have plenty of devices at home that continuously listen to me, right? And, when you think about it, that's creepy, right? That's so creepy. It continuously analyzes what I'm saying, picks up some keywords and then reacts to it. And I should be creeped out, right? But no, it allows me to start my vacuuming robot without, getting up from my sofa, right? I'll go for it, right?
That's called digital laziness.
That's called digital laziness, right? So is it really? Or, are we thinking, Paula, 20 years ago, you did not do the research 20 years ago, but you did research on some of the digital, I would call it innovation in file sharing, in peer-to-peer music sharing and so on that happened 15, 20 years ago or so. Was it bad or was it good or, was it responsible?
Yeah, so it's one of those unique situations where at the time, some parties thought Napster was not great. But if it wasn't for Napster, we wouldn't have the Netflix, the Spotify. We wouldn't be where we are today. But interestingly, if the Recording Institute of America hadn't tried to whack-a-mole and stop innovation and stop disruption, maybe we would actually have one platform rather than me having to subscribe to 8 different platforms to consume the entertainment that I want. So I think it's interesting, I call that positive deviance, that it's something that may have been a bit off and perhaps outright illegal at the time, but it actually led to a huge innovation. So I think it's interesting when organizations try to suppress or whack-a-mole any kind of progress that's happening because you don't know where it's actually eventually going to lead.
But the issue here is the regulators. So I talk to a lot of companies that are becoming disruptors and I say, you need to go and chat to the regulators and take the financial market, and we're in CBA's bank here. So if companies want to disrupt, the regulator's going to try and stop them because the regulation is probably 3 or 5 years away. Why don't the disruptors go and engage the regulators? And then a few weeks ago, I got to speak to the Welsh Government, to a group of regulators, and to them, why don't, as regulators, you understand what the disruptors need? And the two will come together. I think what happens is the regulators sit on one side of the equation and the disruptors sit on the other. If the two were physically, emotionally, commercially closer together, I think you'd have less of the whack-a-mole because it'd be like the regulator going, I get why you need that, and the disruptor going, I get why you've got to regulate me that way, and it wouldn't take so long for the cycle times. I think we need to have agile disruption and regulation.
And unfortunately, the problem with regulation, and we've seen it in the past couple of months, is that regulators have almost no digital intelligence, right? So they ask questions that are downright ridiculous when they question big tech, and that's very disappointing. Paula, one other term that you sometimes use is deviance-led innovation, right? That's deviance with CE at the end, not TS, right? So deviance-led innovation. Do you think it has future? Shall we be encouraging organizations to try to, how should we call it, like chief deviant officer, right? Let's let's see what we could do in a way that's wrong, and see whether it could trigger something new, something valuable for our customer base.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And I know Andrew will have a perspective on this, is if you ask organizations to do the same thing that they've always done, they're going to reap the same results. So why not look at different ways to do things and fail fast, do it on a small scale so it doesn't cost a lot of money, and then if it works, great, keep investing in it and moving forward. I know that's something that we preach to a lot of, especially our government clients, around improving processes or looking at the way that things that, have always been done. So I'm very much an advocate. We know within boundaries. I'm not trying to promote the next Enron, but...
Yeah. And breaking rules is really easy for a startup. So what Uber did was, rather than going to 100 different cities to say, we'd like to come and disrupt your taxi industry, they basically did the same thing globally and waited until people did the whack-a-mole. Whereas large organisations are saying, we have to play by the rules. And so it's harder for us to fail. And the four-letter word fail, the F word in an organisation, means I lose my job. So I spent 12 years in startups before IBM, so I'm used to a fail-fast culture. And then you move to a large organisation and failure equals loss of job. And so we need to be more digitally courageous, and we need to have more boards that are digitally literate to say, yeah, it may fail, it may take 2 weeks and we'll burn 2 weeks of effort, but we might learn something and we might actually innovate faster than we normally would have.
All right, so I need to interject here. Let's talk about accountability. Do you have any examples where, either way, right, organizations are too accountable, as in, they keep saying sorry, or they're trying to ignore whatever's happening?
Well, my perspective on accountability, and Leanne sort of brought up this idea about sustainability reports. How can we ensure that companies are going to be authentically accountable? Because when I was in the US a couple of weeks ago, I was watching this repeated advert with, oh my gosh, I've just gone completely blank. Mark Zuckerberg talking over the Facebook kind of thing, where it's like, here's what Facebook used to be, here's what everything that went wrong, and here's what we're going to do better. But coming out after an inquiry just doesn't seem very authentic. It feels very forced. So how do we stop all these companies coming out and looking like greenwashing, like we do with sustainability? And how do you prove that they're actually doing something and actually being accountable and actually changing what their practices are? And I don't think we've seen that. When there was the Sony hack, the Target hack, maybe people cared less about the Ashley Madison hack, but what did they do?
They do.
What did they do that was different to help protect the data? And we don't know that.
Well, today there's been a huge hack of Carphone Warehouse here in the UK. So hundreds, if not millions, of credit card details are now out in the dark web. So it'll be interesting to see how they respond to that. I think companies that will survive will hold their hand up and say, yeah, we got it wrong. And not just we're sorry, but this is why we got it wrong and this is what we're doing to change it. We've seen in Australia some very large fines handed out and some very large accountability happening. I think the companies that will get through that will go, yeah, we did a bad thing, we're gonna change.
All right, so as someone who works for a university, teaches students, are we seeing jobs of the future? I might have mentioned Chief Deviant Officer, it was a joke, but are we, or maybe it wasn't, are we seeing any other jobs that might be coming up?
Well, I think when it comes to responsibility, I'd like to see whether it's an algorithm bias officer or designing out deviance officer or something, because if you're, and we're already seeing platforms emerge like the Algorithm Justice League, which is where you can say whether an algorithm was biased towards you recently, so they can collect information on that, or whether it's having an app called Fair Square, which is looking at testing different algorithms to see whether or not they're actually fair and appropriately used to different populations. So it's that third-party sense check of what you're about to put out in the market is actually going to be responsible.
Got it. Andrew?
And I think ethics in AI is going to be incredibly important. Do we trust the robot, and who has programmed the robot, and what are their ethics? Yeah. So I think, a chief ethics officer will be very important. But then how do we trust the ethics officer that they're not ethical? It could be a round rob conversation.
Yeah. Or I know Marek likes to say, how do you get one algorithm to sense check and be the ethics officer of another algorithm?
Guess who's paid the most money?
Yeah, is it even possible? What could go wrong, right? We're overusing those C-level roles, right? But chief paranoid officer, right? What could go wrong if we release this product? We have a sexting app, right? What could go wrong if we release it, right? Like the Ashley Madison that you just mentioned. Absolutely. Well. Paula, Andrew, thank you very much for this conversation. We'll have Q&A in a few minutes. Let's then explore. If you have any questions, think about them already now. But for now, thank you so much, Paula. Andrew, if you could stay here just for a second, all right? Thank you.
So thank you. Our final last point, aspirational. We want to leave on a good note. It is London Tech Week. Leanne Kemp, back again. Thank you. All right.
Righty-go. Get your money's worth today, boys.
There you go, Leanne.
You're getting paid, are you?
Yeah.
Where do we start after that?
Ethical. Very ethical.
Yes, aspirational, ethical. I think Leanne had a good start at the previous panel to it already. I perhaps just wanted to say one thing. In the conversation so far, we did talk a lot about things that could go wrong. But let's remember, those who see challenges as opportunities actually have the biggest chance of succeeding in this space. So I think the aspirational one, and let's have this conversation here in this discussion right now. How could organizations benefit from being more aspirational? And we've had examples of organizations that decided to go in this direction. Some of them work really well. I guess, Tom's could be an example of one that is perceived as a very aspirational organization. Some of them, like One Laptop Per Child initiative, I guess got us thinking. They're not, they don't deliver those laptops anymore as far as I'm aware, but at least they started the conversation. So what's happening in this space? And Leanne, let's continue what you just started, right? So are we using up the resources of the earth? Should we change? What is the opportunity there?
So I wasn't prepared for your question, but so you've got me thinking faster than I'd like to be.
Working
at lunchtime.
agile.
Yeah, working agile. So I think your question about being aspirational, that's nice. I liked unicorns when I was a little girl too.
Uh-huh.
But to be prepared to disrupt yourself, to be prepared to admit to your own existential crisis, and combine that with the aspiration of so be willing and brave enough. And I did this. I worked in Australia. I've had a number of startups. I've been mildly successful there. I've exited those business to an ASX listed company. Great, high five. But was I brave enough to cut the string to the boats? Was I brave enough to literally take a backpack, to turn around and say, I'm going to disrupt my entire life and just go for something that I think is possible, take a 500-year-old industry that's, bound by monopolies, very big organisations that are kind of scary, and just go for this. And I think organisations don't necessarily truly do that. They do it under the roof of what we're sitting in here, an innovation lab. They invite in a couple of cool startups and they say, let's innovate. But are they really innovating at the core to say, I'm changing the very core of who I am? Because the world that sits beneath their feet is changing considerably. And so I think it's got to go beyond aspirations. Aspirations is nice, but it's more than that.
All right, Andrew?
There are three types of people in the world, and you're all represented here in the room. There are prayers, stayers, and players. Now, you'll self-select as to which one you think you are. The aspirational ones are absolutely the players. They're out there trying the new things, disrupting themselves. The prayers are a year away from retirement or changing jobs. They just hope this is going away, and the stayers are trying to just stay the course. And I say this to people all the time. You have to disrupt yourself, you'll be disrupted. And I spend my life doing that, and I built a career on telling people to do that, but then I come back and realise they haven't. So tomorrow I'm jumping on a plane, or actually this afternoon I'm jumping on a train to go to Brussels to speak to my perfect client, their 100-year-old insurance house. They know they have to transform. They are incredibly conservative, and they've got me in to give them some ideas about how they disrupt themselves. And what I said, look, I'm not going to come and speak to you unless I leave that room with your CEOs committing to 3 things you're going to do differently. So they built that in. So I'm going to speak to 80 of their CEOs, global CEOs, tomorrow morning. And at the end of my talk, they have to fill in the app the 3 things they're going to do in the next 30 days that are different. I want to follow them up. So to be aspirational, you have to have a management team that says, yeah, we're going to really shake things up, or we won't be around here in 5 years' time.
I mean, and we have aspirations now. The reality is, a home topic is the Great Barrier Reef. And then, we have water bottles that are sitting in our hands every time we walk down the street because it's convenient to buy a water bottle, which is, of course, PET. But is anyone really thinking about, and the aspiration for the world is to not have that happen. We're watching it before our very eyes. But is anyone actually saying, well, we need to rethink that entire system, it's broken, to the detriment of ourselves, but for the betterment of next generation? That's the piece. So there's aspiration there, but aspiration just isn't enough.
These are some very powerful comments here, and I when I was listening to both of you, Leanne and Andrea, I thought it's a bit like an existential crisis of organizations, right? They're just thinking, okay, we've got here, but are we doing the right thing? And it's a bit like with humans, the non-existent but often talked about midlife crisis, right? Where it's like, what do I do with my life? I ended up here.
You start Everledger.
Yeah, that's good, right? Yeah, that's better than buying a fast red car, right?
I've done that. Did that at 30.
No, fast red cars have got airbags. Everledger doesn't have an airbag.
There you go. That's good. Now, look, there are those wonderful social entrepreneurs. It feels like it's easier to start as an aspirational organization than be a successful organization and then switch to become an aspirational one. That's at least what I'm observing with the sort of the business school perspective and so on, right? Any thoughts on this one? So I get your point, Leanne, right? But I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs who really would disagree, who would say, hey, I can be aspirational and I'm going to start from there and then I'm going to develop everything else.
Yeah, I mean, so to a certain extent, yes, but the problem is funding. So. Yeah. At all times. And we've seen even very large corporations, Unilever should be applauded. The CEO really stepped out in a significant way and said, don't expect profits. We are completely reinvesting back into our supply chain and our supply line. But over a period of time, he was then highly criticised because no one recognised the triple bottom line effect that he was having, which, of course, the pebble effect of that is far-reaching, far outward than just Unilever and Unilever's
and
employees.
Beyond when he leaves as the CEO.
Yeah, and so even from our perspective, we've come into the space, but at the end of the day, we have commercial pressures. We have pressures to perform in terms of revenue and return. So, this next level of work that's happening in the space, particularly in our world, is impact investing. And I think that full consciousness should meet consciousness and aspiration. But it comes back down to the mechanics of money. It's all about money.
All right, impact investing, money. Can you measure the impact of your investment in that aspiration space? I find, a lot of organizations find it hard to measure their impact. Is there anything you're doing in this space, in the Everledger space at the moment?
So, our team just flew back this morning. I flew from New York, but my team flew back from Tanzania. So we've been on the ground over the course of the last week with artisanal small-scale mining and with tanzanite and some of the coloured gemstones there. So the impact we don't have today with empirical evidence, but we will have in the course of the next year. And we know and we can quantify the impact that that's having, not only on the value chain of those coloured gemstones, but the people impact. The ability to take, coloured gemstones that might proliferate into a large brand organisation like Cartier or Swarovski, how can they be involved in seeing where the source of their gemstones have come from, but the impact of that community? So in those communities are women, and the women have the ability to do colour sorting and grading on these gemstones, but they don't even know what they have, the value they have in their hand, because the value they have in their hand was never necessarily realised until it left the country and ended up in a large trading centre like London or in the US. But with education, we can educate within country, and Tanzania has the ability to actually preserve value and create a community. So these mining producing nations, we've seen the greatness of that already. Botswana was created on the tail end of De Beers and enabling them to create, a multi-billion-dollar organisation and industry around the world. But the reality is the value leaked completely from that country. So yes, you have to be brave enough. You've got to be brave enough to literally run through the brick wall and challenge large-scale mining companies and then bring the profits back into the people. Well, why not?
Perfect. You're going to stay with us for a few minutes after the Q&A, right?
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. Thank you. If you have any questions about it, I think it's actually a very important topic, and I don't want to spend too much time discussing this right now, but if you have questions, how you measure impact and so on, let's have it during the networking one. Andrew, as a practical futurist, what's the future there?
Well, as you're talking, I was just thinking that there are a lot of companies, there's the FANG group, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, that are just spinning off so much money. Now, part of it is because they've been very efficient with their tax, which is a whole other discussion. But they all started aspirationally, and now they worked out they can make a ton load of money. Bill Gates, it took him to leave Microsoft and have his father say, you have so much money, you can never spend it in your lifetime. You need to start doing something with it. And Bill went, you know what, I'm going to become a philanthropist. I'm going to start giving it back. I'm just wondering where all these companies have so much cash they're throwing off, why aren't they playing it back and doing the Unilever thing? Maybe some of them are, but there is just so much extra cash. I mean, Apple and others, they can't buy the stock back. They can't spend it fast enough. So why aren't governments or why aren't companies themselves saying, hey, we want to be an absolutely corporate citizen. We want to help governments and the private sector do good with this money because we can't spend it fast enough. I think that's a discussion that is going to happen as these companies make more and more and more and more money.
Fantastic. Leanne, Andrew, thank you so much for your views. Let's now invite the Paula and Ivano to the stage here. And we're going to have a Q&A session for the next few minutes. So we just need an extra chair for Ivano.
Thought it might have been Kumbaya. We bring out the...
Don't worry, Paula will start singing in a minute if you just give her a microphone.
All right. Thanks so much for helping with this.
So I'll be the mic jockey.
Thanks.
So anyone, all right, I guess we'll kick it off to the room now. We've heard from our speakers around aspirational, responsible and trusted. What questions we have from the audience? Down the back.
Thank you. My question is around this concept of making large enterprises, very large enterprises, such as Tier 1 banks in the UK, truly innovative and in building a culture of innovation. And it's a genuine question I'm battling with at the moment because on one hand, it seems to me the way they will innovate is kind of like this room where a group of people will actually the innovation will center around a small number of individuals who are planning out the path for the whole organization, and ultimately headcount reduction will be the end result, and the banks will shrink and become more efficient electronically, and that making every single one of their 100,000 employees today innovative is not necessarily truly part of the game. And I suspect that actually there's a bit of hoodwinkery going on in terms of what their real ambitions are in that space. Any comments?
Can I take this? So for those here in the UK, you know that open banking has launched, or you probably don't because it launched with a whimper in February. Open banking is an EU directive. It's called the Payment Services Directive number 2, to give it its sexy title. It essentially allows banks or forces banks to provide API, application programming interface, to your data. I think this is, one, it's regulated disruption, but secondly, it is actually a monumental shift change because banks wouldn't have done this if they hadn't been told to do it. I think you'll find the fruits of that labour in the next couple of years when the smart fintechs in Shoreditch go, we can do something really sexy with your financial information your bank never had the intention to. And it will then force banks to go, why can't we do that? And people are going to leave us to go with someone else, and the non-branches, the Monzos and the Atoms are going to win out. So I think open banking is forced the big banks to do something. It's now opening it up for the little guys to have a play with it. I think you'll see the same thing happen in utilities and telco, and eventually consumer will say, why can't I have access to my data? But the problem is the innovation centres, and Barclays is a great example. Why I praise Barclays for having their own RISE centres in London and Tel Aviv and New York. Literally, they're in a different building to the bank. And what has to happen is the innovation centres, I mean, CBA is co-located with the part of the bank here, which is great, but you can't have them in different suburbs because eventually you have to come back to the mothership. You need to be sitting next to someone who is born digital, next to someone who is going digital, and actually be able to do that skills transfer. Will everyone be highly digital in every bank? No. You need enough, though. You just don't need the innovation team. But I think this year with GDPR and open banking, it finally gives the little guys a chance to innovate, and the big guys will follow.
Thank you. Next question here. let's keep those questions to a tweet-worthy length. Thanks,
With a question mark at the end, you said.
That's it.
My question is on the role of governments. I'm from Tanzania, by the way. So I wanted to know what would be your suggestion for governments to foster the digital economy and make sure it's not just the regulations, but all the other systems that push citizens to be more innovative.
So I think the African nations as a collective, Tanzania being one example, there's an awakening from the level of the citizens that enough is enough, and I certainly think that a part of the education set that exists not only within each of these larger cities in the African nations, but the fact that there is some level of connectivity in those major cities, so therefore education is at the fingertips of the citizens. And so they're becoming more aware, and they have the ability to not only just be more vocal locally, but they're becoming educated in the context of the larger world. And so I think we're going to naturally see a rise towards more digital natives that exist within emerging countries. I believe that's where the power of the future lies. I don't believe the power of the future lies in large cities or in Russia and the US. I think it's in the African nations. I think it's in South America. I think it's in ASEAN. That's where I believe to be the power. Governments, they're slow. So too is our legal system. So the government, the legal system, they're all reacting to social change, digital change. So they're historians. They have the ability to say, that happened yesterday, geez, we need to do something about it, let's report on it. But they're not necessarily thinking, governments aren't thinking in an agile way. And how you change that, maybe 2 or 3 generations' time, that will change naturally, because the citizens that will be sitting and making the decisions about the future of the world are going to be digital natives. And there was a great photograph that went around more recently. I think there was a collective between the US representatives and the Chinese representatives back in 1930 or whatever it was. And at that point in time, there was a polarized photo. On one side of the table were 20 Chinese, and those Chinese were ancient men, right? Ancient decision makers that were sitting there with these young Americans. And the more recent photo was a complete opposite. We have these old, staid suits and boots in the US, and these really young, empowered and educated Chinese. And I think that is a picture that will largely transform the future.
Can I just add a very quick thing on this? Maybe it might sound obvious as well, but if we think that around 50% of the global population is still not connected, imagine if we start building more effectively infrastructures. And I think that in that space, kind of taking back something that Leanne was talking about, large corporations and government can really collaborate. So imagine enforcing and besides your regulation and training, also providing basics as in infrastructure, and you're going to connect the other 50% of population to the internet. Well, imagine the potential for further innovation that we can get from that as well.
And just a plug for Queensland. I mean, the reality is that as a state in our country, we have a chief entrepreneur. I mean, entrepreneur in residence that is there to bridge the thinking of government, the connection between scale-ups and startups, and so it's those types of roles and the recognition of that beyond just cool real estate and sort of free soda in the fridge. That's the thing that's going to transform as well.
Thank you. Next question.
Okay, so it's really interesting, the aspiration and responsibility and digital natives of third world. But what is the time scale, would you guys say, that we have to think about when we think about change? Say I refer to the peak oil, peak uranium, things like this.
Yeah. So change is happening across the world in exponential form. So, I mean, we're even questioning now the questioning Moore's law and where does quantum computing come in and what does this mean in terms of even security constructs. So change is upon us in a significant way. And I'm an official appointment with the World Economic Forum and I look at the vision for 2030, but it's the combination of not just one layer of technologies, the emergence of all of those together. So we're seeing exponential technologies converge. We're seeing data converge. And when we have that sort of artificial intelligence layer, these machine-driven powered decisions are going to happen well beyond the speed of thought. And it's probably already there now. I just look at my own stepdaughter and I look at my own nieces, and they're writing apps on phones, and they could code faster than I can think about what it is that they're trying to explain to me. So they're showing me in a digital form what they're trying to explain to me, and this is scary. I mean, I'm worried about what's going to be like in a nursing home.
I can't get Wi-Fi.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, at the back. I think we're going to have to help me here, Joe.
Chairman, we have Phil Donahue there. No one knows who Phil Donahue is?
To Leanne's point, I don't know if any of you read Kai-Fu Lee's article last year talking about with AI and right now the only two countries in the world, being China and the US, having the large enough data sets and the advances currently in AI that at some point in the world, in the future, maybe every country is going to be paying tolls to all the companies in China and the US. Do you have a view of what other countries should be doing to try and keep up or be relevant in that realm before they lose tax bases?
Yeah, there's a very astute view on the reality of exactly where it sits. So, I mean, we work in the diamond space, and one thing we did that was genius, pat myself on the back, was to enable a set of algorithms under machine vision to identify diamonds. But the set of our data was relatively limited because we have to truffle pig our way around the world and work out where we're getting diamonds from, and we're a small company with only 50 people. But the availability of data sets perpetuates that intelligence layer, and you are right, the size of the data that sits within these two very large continents by far surpasses. The only thing I can say is that I was at CHOGM this year, and I had a delightful meeting with the Prime Minister in a private meeting. And a part of the work that is going on is to understand from a Commonwealth perspective how, if post-Brexit, how could that actually be forged forward and how could that give a collective strength? And so that's sort of an interesting angle that has been discussed about. Now, of course, we talk about cross-border trade and bits and pieces that need to be fixed up, but arguably you can't argue the size of the database that exists or the data streams that exist in the US and China. But they've hidden it behind a wall, but they won't hide it behind a wall forever. They'll come out when they're ready. And when they come out, it'll be way too late. Yeah, it's a worry. So, I mean, I'm nearly at a pensioners discount, so I'm excited about that in Australia because we get discounts for all sorts of stuff with car insurance. So I'm hopeful that when that all happens, I'm rocking in a corner somewhere in Brisbane and, happy to see my last days out. Yeah, counting my diamonds.
Thank you. Right at the front.
So this is a question more for Paula. We've seen Wells Fargo, Uber, Facebook do these mass media campaigns in the States, mea culpas of really softly spoken, we screwed up. But Facebook's share price has about rebounded. Uber's not going anywhere. Wells Fargo's not going anywhere. Do you think they get it? Do you think
we get it?
Do you think the corporates get it?
Yeah, and I'm saying, do you think we get it? I mean, when BP spilled oil everywhere, we still went to a BP oil station. When the China was releasing kids' toys that were using lead paint, like we still ended up buying them after the crisis. There's two answers to that. One is customer satisfaction can actually increase to a higher level if you have something go wrong and then they do something after to resolve it than if the service had gone appropriately in the first place. So that's one human psychology around why we continue to still use these. But then the other psychology is, if you take Amazon, for example, they tried to invest in, I think it was mobile phones or something, and the share price went up when they announced it, and then it went terribly wrong, and they were like, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, and the share price went up again because they trusted that they were trying something with their investment. But when it comes to companies continuously doing the wrong thing, there's no alternative to Facebook. You know, there's no alternative really if you're using that bank. What are you going to do? Switch bank? There's so many exit costs associated with that. So I feel like we're, as a society, we're quite apathetic, which is why I like to continuously challenge. Yeah, I know my data is being harvested everywhere, but meh. Like, how much does it actually, like, it has not negatively affected my life yet. So until it does, I'm going to remain an apathetic consumer for it. So I think they're just going to keep getting away with it.
Part of that completely irrelevant then? Do they not have?
Well, that's why I think the duty component is so fascinating, because what is the right thing, but also if they're doing the right thing or if they're doing the wrong thing, how much do I care? So yeah, I think that's very interesting.
That was
Does anyone want to add to that?
I mean, kudos, I agree. Absolutely.
conscious of time, everyone. That was a fantastic Q&A, so I'll have to call it there. But if you could all, with me, applaud our Q&A panellists. Thank you, everyone. Andrew, Leanne, Paula and Ivano, feel free to take your seats. That's us.
All right, just a couple of minutes of wrapping things up. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for being with us. Hey, we went from trust through responsibility to aspiration. The name of the event is The Art of Digital, but I'm sure it couldn't really escape your attention that all of the points of the conversations were ultimately leading to the human aspects of this world, right? So we did talk about digital intelligence. We did talk about global commons and the impact of whatever is happening on the world. We did talk about an impact that a technology can have on an individual somewhere in a rural town in whatever corner of the world, which I find absolutely fascinating. I find it fascinating that we start with digital, we end with human, and I think that's an important message to remember when we talk about societal excellence in the digital economy. It is all about humans. Well, once again, thank you everyone for joining us during the event today. I just have a couple of notes. I wanted to thank Commonwealth Bank of Australia for facilitating the event here, and Filippo Ferrari. He's not here right now, but he's been absolutely fantastic working with us. I wanted to thank Trade and Invest in Queensland for being a fantastic supporter. I wanted to help Sheila Whittlestone, who's here with us from QUT, who helps us orchestrate everyone around this event. Our speakers, obviously, so Leanne, Andrew, Ivano, Paula, thank you so much for that. Pete DMC, where's Pete? He's just disappeared. Oh yeah, there you go. Thank you, Pete. There's been a team behind this event. Back in Australia, some of them get really large, so we have to have a strong team. Jody back there, who's taking photos all the time and tweeting. Thank you, Jody, for helping us with that. Back in Australia, watching us right now, thanks Gemma and Chelsea. Fantastic as well. We have a few partners. Just like Pete mentioned, it is a partnership of a university, industry, and two governments, which is a fantastic thing to have. And talk to us about how you get government to talk to industry, to talk to universities, and actually get something done. I think we figured out how to do it. We are headquartered at QUT Business School, which is a wonderful place to work for. Thank you once again. Subscribe to our updates if you're interested over here. We still have a few minutes for networking. Thanks so much.